Fort George was the name of 5 forts in the state of New York. The first Fort George was built in 1626 in New Amsterdam and named Fort Amsterdam. The British Army renamed it Fort James in 1664. It was briefly reoccupied by the Dutch from 1673 to 1674 as Fort Willem Hendrik. The British named the fort Fort William Henry in 1691, Fort Anne or Queen's Fort in 1703, and finally Fort George in 1714. The north side bastions and ramparts were destroyed in 1776 by the Americans and finally demolished in 1790. The site is now a museum and courthouse in Lower Manhattan. A second Fort George was built by the British in 1755 at Oswego, New York, but it was destroyed by the French commander Louis-Joseph de Montcalm in 1756. Site is now Montcalm Park at the junction of W. Van Buren Street, Montcalm Street and West 6th Street. A third Fort George was built in Lake George, New York in 1755. It was destroyed in 1777 and finally abandoned in 1780. It was located southeast of Fort William Henry facing Lake George. A fourth Fort George was an encampment built on Staten Island around 1777 in the area of St. George, Staten Island. The last Fort George, or Fort George Hill, was built in 1776 in New York City near the current intersection of Audubon Avenue and 192nd Street in Upper Manhattan. Briefly named Fort Clinton and finally Fort George. From 1895 to 1914 it was the site of the Fort George Amusement Park, and is now George Washington High School. Fort George Hill is also the name of a present-day street near this Fort George.